a Sapphire Running Zone podcast.
Hi everyone, this is Tim from the Sapphire Running Zone, and today we're going to chat through things like supplements, gels, all that kind of stuff. Because there's so many things out there, so many myths that we want to chat through. There's so many influencers saying you got to do this or you got to do that. There's a lot of confusion out in the marketplace, almost too much information. So delighted to be joined by Matt, who's an absolute specialist in this area, and we are going to go through point by point some of the key areas. So welcome, Matt. Just give me a little bit of your background.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, sure. So my name's Matt. People in the running community tend to know me because I've got a couple of social media channels. And so I go by Matt Endurance Scientist on Instagram and TikTok. My day job is I'm a lecturer in sports science at the University of Northampton. I'm just coming towards the end of my PhD within sort of performance nutrition and endurance exercise. I've looked at the impact of dietary changes and supplements on endurance performance. And so kind of got a few strands there. But yeah, day job is I'm a lecturer. And what I'm trying to do with my social media is kind of bring evidence and, what is often common knowledge within the academic and sort of applied world into social media, because I think, as I'm sure people listening are aware, there's a lot of information online. There's a lot of misinformation online. And so I'm trying my best to kind of outline, I guess, not necessarily what I think, but what the evidence and the consensus is within the world of research, and bring that to people that are interested in improving their endurance performance.
Great stuff. So we're going to talk through some of the key areas in training. So covering sort of 10Ks, half marathons, and we're going to look at what the requirements are really for training. Now, we all know that we need to get ourselves a decent training plan, and the training plans often don't talk about supplements or gels or any of this stuff. They just give you the mileage that you should be doing, when you should be doing a rest day. And then unfortunately, some of the gaps tend to be filled in by some of this misinformation. There's an assumption these days that you have to be taking huge amounts of gels and supplements and all sorts of other things. So let's talk, Matt, about someone who's training for their first half marathon. So say they're on a 12-week plan. What would your advice be when it comes to something like gels?
So gels are very convenient, and that's sort of always how I start by describing them, because I think what I see often in the running community is there's an assumption that gels are a requirement and they're needed. And actually, particularly because of the cost, I know a lot of people that can train throughout a whole half marathon, any race, and you don't need any gels, but they serve a purpose. And that purpose is they're a quick and accessible form of carbohydrate that you can take out on a run, you can take quickly before a run. So there's a convenience there, but fundamentally there's nothing special about a gel. It is a carbohydrate. And so doing a half marathon, we've got to think about, when do you need gels or when do you need carbohydrate during a run? Half marathon, an elite athlete might do it in an hour. Most people, though, we're looking at, say, hour and a half to 2 hours and beyond. And so most people won't need that much carbohydrate. Now, the way I would tend to recommend on race day, and I would sort of always suggest we look at race day and work back, and that's how you can sort of work out fueling around training, is that you don't need more than 2 gels. 2 gels is your kind of upper limit, or 2 carbohydrate boluses, or 2 intakes of carbohydrate. It doesn't have to be a gel, but whatever works for someone, whether that be, 30 grams worth of Turkish Delight, that's actually quite convenient. It's also very cheap. Lots of different ways to do it, but 1 to 2 drinks or gels during a half marathon works fine, works fairly well. Now, again, there'll be people that run half marathons and take nothing. If you've got a drink that you put some carbohydrate in, and again, you can buy a carbohydrate drink or just add dextrose into your drink, fraction the price, that's just as good as a gel. There's nothing inherently special about them. But looking at that and working backwards is that if you're only ever going to take 1, maximum 2 gels on race day, you don't need to take any more than that when you're training. And actually, all you're using things like gels or carbohydrate drinks for then during training is to make sure, number one, that you're ready to mimic or ready to do what you're going to do on race day. So you practiced your race day nutrition plan. And number 2, that you're fueling your training properly. So that means what I would always suggest to people is obviously never do anything new on race day. So if you're going to take 2 gels, say on race day, then for your longer runs during your half marathon plan, maybe you've got a weekly long run, that's a great time to just practice your fueling strategy for your race, which might be a gel for a half marathon, say you're having a gel at 45 minutes, an hour and a half, if you're running around 2 hours, for example, then you can build that into what you're doing during training, just so you're not ever doing anything new on race day, because that's when you get stomach issues and things like that. On top of that, then it's just about, there's a concept I really like called fueling the work required. What that means is on hard days, that's when maybe you can say, okay, maybe I'll have a gel before I start to really give myself a little bit extra energy. I'll get through a hard session, whatever it might be, a track session or an interval session. And then on my easy days, you don't need to worry about it. And so the concept of fueling for the work required means that on days where you may be doing your long run, well, that's when you can focus on, have a couple of gels, maybe one before, maybe one during. On the days where you've got slow run, recovery run, those kind of things, it's something you shouldn't even have to worry about. Now, the only time I would say any different is that if someone's worried about stomach issues. And so there's a thing called training your gut, which is basically training your stomach to be able to tolerate a gel. Now, most people taking one or two, you're going to be okay. But I'd always suggest, if you're having any stomach issues, number one, try something else. Have a sports drink. I tend to find they're tolerated better. But if you're really determined to take gels, then just practice a bit more often. Have them during easier runs, any kind of long run, just to train your stomach to get used to them. And again, it's serving the purpose there of making sure that you're not stopping at a poor two on race day. But yeah, that's this short answer is that the harder days, maybe you can build gels around them. But actually, again, this is all about using carbohydrate. So we talk about gels. Actually, it could be a sports drink. It could be some honey. It could be anything else. It could be dextrose powder that you buy for $4.99 for 100 servings, and you just pour into a glass of squash. You can do any of those things, and you're saving yourself £2 a serving, which adds up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if you're doing a 10K, you probably should have started with that. If you're doing a 10K, you don't really need to be bothering with gels at all.
No, there's no need. There's no physiological need for a gel. You're not going to be running out of your body's carbohydrate stores during a 10K. So there's no inherent need. And most people aren't taking gels on a 10K. Some elite athletes might take one at some point during, but you might save 5 seconds, you might not. We don't know. So yeah,
Right.
No inherent need.
So switching to a marathon then, obviously, twice the distance, but more likely that you're gonna have issues around carbohydrate levels. But like you said, there is an assumption now that it is absolutely essential, and you have to take them. I've done a lot of marathons over the years, and I'd say probably only half of them did I actually train using gels or even take them on race day. A lot of the times I didn't even go near them, and things were fine. But it generally was linked to what my training block was like and how successful that was. And it's interesting now that there is an assumption you have to take them, and also interesting the profile of gels. Even now, when you watch, obviously there's a fair bit of football on at the moment, but even when you watch football now, you see them coming off the bench or coming out at half time taking gels, and it's almost like, oh, I'm doing some exercise, so I need to take gels. But obviously not the case. Well, just give me your thoughts on if someone's starting from scratch, they're starting their training from scratch, and they're going to be doing a marathon next year. What's your take on that?
Oh, yeah, do you know what? I'm not going to, but I could talk about this for hours and hours, because the things you mentioned there. So a large part of my PhD was looking at essentially our ability to burn fat. So fat oxidation, fat burning. And when you mention the fact that you've run marathons with no gels at all, it's reminiscent of, I interviewed quite a few people that run a lot of ultra marathons. And there are people I spoke to there that had run 100-mile ultra marathons with no carbohydrate during the ultra marathon. Now, I'm not recommending, but one thing I always come back to is it shows kind of the capabilities of the human body, what we're actually able to do. And it comes back to training. Now, someone that's very good at burning fat will be able to run for miles and miles and miles without carbohydrate, because you've got essentially unlimited fat stores on your body. Even lean athletes do, whereas our carbohydrate stores are limited. And now, that means that if someone is very well trained, they actually slightly potentially reduce their need for carbohydrate because they're burning more fat during exercise. Now, during a marathon distance, it is more important and a much bigger consideration, carbohydrate, for most people, because especially if you're not a great fat burner, this is where we can potentially run out of our carbohydrate stores. And so most people have about 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate on at any given point in your muscle and your liver. And so that's around, say, two and a bit hours worth of work of carbohydrate. And so obviously, again, your average runner not running a marathon in 2 hours. And so there is a risk then of running out of carbohydrate. And so there's sort of 2 points to make here. And one is that if you slow down a bit, you can actually run much further than you think without carbohydrate. And I quite like, and I don't tend to recommend this to people if I'm working with them closely, but I would sort of suggest, and I quite like doing this myself, seeing how far I can get without fuel and kind of show yourself what you're able to do without carbohydrate. Because I think there's a concern I have, particularly people that are maybe newish to running and they've seen sort of everyone's taking gels constantly and almost that perceived need. See how far you can actually go without, and actually how strong you are without having that exogenous fuel. And then the carbohydrate gel, that's just a top up. That's a bit of an icing on the cake when the going gets tough type thing. And so current recommendations during marathon running are 60 to 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate. But saying that, there's a lot of research that's sort of afterwards. So that got recommended by sports nutritionists. It's about 2010 that became a thing. It increased from 60 or 30 to 60. And then a few years after, people started to say, what are actually athletes actually doing? Is anyone listening to our advice? And the answer was basically no. Average carbohydrate intake was around 45 grams an hour. And this is in sort of mass participation marathons. So people aren't getting to the numbers that got recommended. And I think there's good reason for that. And now the caveat I would say is that there's no, this is a number of carbohydrates you need. And that's something that people can work out in their own training by practicing and by saying, okay, for my marathon long run, my 30K long run, I'm going to train with, say, 60 grams an hour and see how that goes, see how I react to it. And maybe they can try higher, try lower, and you sort of get to a point that you feel comfortable with. And I always recommend people try more just to see how they feel. And a lot of the time, people feel sick. The important takeaway I always tell people is more is not always better. So for a marathon, some is probably a good thing for most people, but you don't need to constantly look for more and more and more. And the source is also a really important point. I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be a gel. Personally, I much prefer sports drinks. I tolerate them loads better, and I'm keeping myself hydrated. I think hydration, particularly in marathons, and spring marathons seem to always be on hot days at the moment. I think hydration is something that runners almost forget about because they're so focused on fueling and carbohydrate. They forget they need to make sure they're consuming liquids whilst they're running, and dehydration becomes quite a big issue.
And they're not often taking the gels with water to get that hydration either. They're just ripping the top off and taking the whole lot of the gel down in one hit without any water, as opposed to a sports drink, which has obviously got the hydration value and the carbohydrate value. Remind us how much is in a standard gel.
20 to 30 grams usually. So that would be, say, well, if you've got the smaller ones, 20 grams, it's 2 an hour. If you've got the larger ones, sort of just over 1. And so I would always suggest, number one rule, don't do anything on race day you've not done in training before. And particularly in your marathons, you're doing 1 or 2 longer runs a week. That's a great time to practice. And when you're practicing, you're fueling your sessions, but you're also getting ready for what you're going to do on race day. And that's where 45 grams for a marathon, I think, is a good place to start. And then you can work backwards or forwards based on your experiences in training, kind of feedback off your own experiences. And again, that can come from gels. Again, if you're doing that, you're taking 2 or 3 gels on a long run twice a week, that's going to add up. So again, you've got sports drinks. You can make your own sports drinks for fractional prices. And these are really useful ways of saving money, but also looking at what is convenient for your own run. Obviously, it can be inconvenient to run with, a backpack on with a litres worth of fluids. It's also an extra, kilograms worth of weight. And so you've got quite a few things to consider. And training is the best place to do that. You don't want to get to 2 weeks before your marathon and think, right, how much carbohydrate should I be having? That's something you should be working out, ideally, months before the race day.
Yeah, I think, and unless you've actually had an experience where you have found out what happens when you have too much, you don't tend to do it again, do you? But it's very easy to fall into the trap the first time, particularly towards sort of the last third of a marathon, where basically, particularly if you haven't trained properly, you will just hoover up anything that's available. And that is when your race can be completely ruined because, so many occasions people haven't done the long runs that they should have done. They regard gels, and we'll talk a little bit more about supplements in a second. They regard gels and anything else they can get their hands on as a training crutch almost. And that is where the problems happen, because I see people in marathons taking, where gels are provided, taking 2 or 3 in one go and basically just taking the whole lot, not diluting it. And then you'll see them in a ditch 20 minutes later with stuff coming out of both ends. And I think it's a real issue when it's available and you're not thinking straight, which you're not often when you're doing 19, 20 miles. You just want anything to get you round. Unfortunately, the impact, as I've found out to my costs, can be quite severe. So let's talk a little bit about supplements, other sort of trendy areas at the moment. A lot of talk about, electrolytes, magnesium, beetroot juice, creatine. Just give us a little bit of a summary of your thoughts on that area.
Whenever I talk about supplements, and for context, if any listeners on my social media, it's 90% of what I talk about. And the reason for that is it's what people want to talk about. People are obsessed with supplements. I mean, I did a PhD in it, so I can't criticize people for being obsessed. But I always start by saying most supplements don't work. And you should start from the premise that most supplements don't work. And then the few that do work, you probably won't notice them working. And what I mean by that is even the supplements with very good evidence, and beetroot juice is one that goes into that category, good evidence it improves performance, but nothing is magic. And the fact that the effects are so small that it's very hard to notice. And so you've got, there's loads of hype around so many supplements now. We could talk about them forever. But beetroot juice, there's a brilliant group in Australia that work with the Australian Olympic athletes that released sort of an outline of what is an evidence-based supplement. And conveniently, it kind of came to the same conclusion I came to, which is that there's basically within endurance 4 supplements with pretty good evidence. And they are caffeine, beetroot juice, beta-alanine, and sodium bicarbonate. And now the caveat there is that those last 2, sodium bicarbonate and beta-alanine, very much focused towards shorter events. You're rowing 2K is a perfect example, actually, but anything up to about 8 minutes, they might have benefits. Beyond that, the jury's still out. And I say that sodium bicarbonate has become very popular within marathon running as well. Evidence isn't there to support it right now, possibly amongst elite athletes, definitely not amongst sub-elite athletes. And if you think that carbohydrate can give you stomach issues, try taking sodium bicarbonate. But then that brings us to beetroot juice and caffeine. The two, for say a long duration race, your half marathons, your marathons, 2 genuinely evidence-based supplements. So beetroot juice increases something called nitric oxide availability. Long story short, your blood vessels get wider. So blood gets through nice and efficiently. So it does work. And it contains carbohydrate, which makes it sort of quite convenient. If you want to have it pre-race, you're also getting your carbohydrate in, which is good. It's also 3 pounds a serving. And the effect size, so the actual amount of difference it's making is very low. So if you want to dot every I and cross every T and you want to absolutely maximize performance, beetroot juice, a couple hours before you go out and run, it has good evidence. You won't notice the difference. And what I mean by that is often people take supplements and they'll find really beneficial effects. And it's very hard to know if something's actually working because of the placebo effect. If you think something's going to work, it's more likely to. And so I think it's always important to be cautious about, firstly, what people say online about supplements, but also actually your own experience. I'm sort of intentionally trying to be very critical about how I feel about certain supplements, because I might, I'm not immune to this. I'll take a supplement and then go out for a run and think, oh, I felt really good in that run. The supplement must have helped. But actually, how was my sleep that night? How's my general recovery feeling? There's a lot more that impacts performance than just recovery. So beetroot juice does benefit endurance exercise, but it's not magic. Maybe you're getting 30 seconds back on a marathon. Maybe you're getting a minute back. These are quite small effects, but it's a supplement that has good evidence, which is rare in the world of supplements. Caffeine, again, similar. Very good evidence, but individual differences are important because some people take caffeine and get very jittery, get very anxious. If that's you, don't take it. It's not magic. But caffeine reduces that feeling of fatigue. It reduces how hard exercise feels, and so it can improve performance. Just like beetroot juice, it's not magic. And again, there's more research now coming out about how much caffeine you need, because there was a big push on you need 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram. Now, to put that into context, for someone that weighs 80 kilograms, 6 milligrams per kilogram is 420 milligrams of caffeine, top of my head. It's a lot of caffeine. And so to me, suddenly you've got to think about the pros and cons of that much caffeine. If I was to try and do a study with that much caffeine, I'd have a big trouble getting it through my ethics board at my university because it's a lot of caffeine. And so there's more research now coming out about essentially lower doses and the fact that lower doses are still going to improve performance. Maybe not to the same extent, but you've probably got a lot less chances of jitters, GI problems, all these kind of things. Now, the only issue with things like coffees, I say this drinking one, is that you don't know how much caffeine's in it. Again, for most people, I'm hoping to run a marathon next year, whatever marathon that might be. Am I going to standardize my caffeine intake, or am I just going to drink a coffee? I'm going to drink a coffee because before most of my runs, I drink a coffee. I know that I can tolerate it fine. There might be an issue. I don't know exactly how much caffeine's in it. Is that issue going to make a meaningful difference to my performance? Probably not. And so again, it's one of those things that it's important to not overcomplicate. If you always have a coffee before you go out for a run, do that again. Like the difference of it might not have quite as much caffeine as the ergogenic dose is the differences are going to be so trivial that for most people, it's not important. And so, there's loads more, but those are the two, caffeine and beet juice, with genuinely good evidence. Now, there's a lot sort of that touch the sides and might have use cases here and there. In the heat right now, if you're doing 2-3 hours exercise a day, then adding sodium in during your day is probably going to be quite important. So things like an electrolyte will be helpful. Again, for most people, no need at all. We're talking now again at the extremes of exercise. If you're in your peak marathon training week, then suddenly adding a sodium drink in here and there might help. But my main takeaway is always that the supplements are the icing on the cake. You can go through a whole marathon training block and your marathon, not touch a single supplement and do just fine. And and I think actually the same story with gels. Okay, and I might do this as a sort of case study just to prove it next year. You could go through a whole marathon training block with no gels and no supplements, and you would do just fine.
So would you regard creatine as a supplement? Because that's obviously got different benefits, hasn't it?
Yeah, creatine's a really interesting one because it's again, one of the most researched supplements in the world of sort of bodybuilding, powerlifting, and any kind of resistance training. Creatine is ubiquitous. Everyone takes creatine, very good evidence for it, for enhancing power output, so improving strength. The evidence when we're looking at endurance exercise is minimal, but it's also, I put it in a category of things where the benefits aren't particularly well established. There are some potential ones, but also the downsides are very low. Right? We know creatine is safe. There's so much research on its safety, and we know it's not going to make your performance worse. There are some suggestions. There are sort of 2 or 3 potential reasons why people might want to use it for endurance exercise. The one I think has the most sort of support within science is recovery. So supporting recovery if you're taking it day to day. But there is also sort of, particularly in cycling, more so than running actually, but if you're running hillier races or anything like that. So I'll rewind actually just very quickly. How does creatine work? You've got 3 energy systems more or less in your body. You've got your long duration aerobic system, which we're using mostly as runners, and you've got sort of more high intensity ones. Creatine works on the highest intensity systems, so your real explosive movements. And now that doesn't seem to directly translate to running. But what you've got to think about is when you're running a marathon, if you've suddenly got a big hill to compete with, well, then you're going to suddenly see a spike in heart rate and you will start to use those higher intensity systems. And so things like hill efforts or things like a sprint finish, suddenly creatine could be useful. Now, recovery then also comes in because it may have some potential recovery benefits. It may have some potential anti-inflammatory effects, although again, not particularly well established. But we know there's very little downside. The downside people do worry about is that you retain slightly more weight when you consume creatine. You're holding on to slightly more water. There's 2 reasons that I would always tell people not to worry about that. One is there's quite a lot of research looking at a VO2 max. So your all-out fitness showing there's no difference, even though you weigh slightly more, maybe half a kilo. But also dehydration can be quite a negative, particularly in a marathon. So if you're starting with greater content of water in your body, that's probably not a bad thing at all. So actually that hydration point could even be beneficial. And so again, it's another thing that's not magic, but during heavy training blocks, there's very little downside to including it. It's also very cheap. There's a lot of different types. Creatine monohydrate is the cheapest and the one that research uses all the time. And so I always tell people, don't fall for any special formulations of creatine. As long as it has some kind of third-party testing, which I'd always recommend for supplements, make sure that your supplement has some kind of third-party testing so you know what's actually in your supplement, because unfortunately, a lot of supplements are contaminated. So consider that. Things like Informed Sport is a really good one to look at. Informed Sport is what all elite athletes essentially are told or have to use, not all of them do, but are told to use to make sure their supplements aren't contaminated. I always tell people if they can, find someone that's got Informed Sport certification. a lot of reputable companies now do, because you know that what's in it is something you can moderately trust. Yeah, creatine, not magic, but again, one other potential benefit of creatine, because there's a lot of sort of things, and there's a lot of hype right now in the endurance world, is that another thing that is sort of just translating around to endurance now is the benefits of strength training. And people that are training seriously for things like running, you benefit a lot from both plyometric and strength work, things like your squats and potentially, your plyometric or explosive type movements. And we know creatine can enhance power output in those types of movements. So it might improve your adaptation to the strength aspect, which is going to improve your running. And so if you're strength training alongside your running, whether that be because you like strength training or you're doing it specifically to be a better runner, then creatine might help you get the most out of those sessions.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. So let's have a quick chat about carb loading. But again, a lot of chatter online about carb loading. A lot of people just don't need to be doing it at all, do they? Just talk us through that.
Yeah, so it all depends on your sort of your day-to-day diet. And so carbohydrate is definitely important, but most people are consuming quite a lot of carbohydrate day-to-day, particularly if they're training for a marathon. And so one thing to think about is that if you're consuming a good amount of carbohydrate for your training, which you should be, eating your meals, snacking, make sure you're fueling the training you're doing. When you're in your taper week, so that week before your marathon, that last week, your training volume is probably at its lowest it's been for a very long time. When you exercise, you burn carbohydrate. So the less you exercise, the more carbohydrate you're holding on to rather than burning. And so if your carbohydrate intake stayed exactly the same that week of the race compared to the week before, but your training volume is lower, which it should be, then your body's going to have more carbohydrate on race day than it would have the week before because you train less. And so that is one thing to consider. Now, carb loading it's a controversial one because it's not a bad thing in itself. But again, the problem I often see with athletes is that they get to their day before and they say, right, I've got a carb load now. And they go absolutely mental, eat more carbohydrate than they ever have in their life, feel absolutely terrible, get to the race and they feel lethargic, horrible. Again, they're going to the portaloos, there's a massive queue, they've got all this stress. And so the bit I always come back to is don't do anything new. So whatever your plan is in the days before a race, make sure you've done it already. Make sure you're not introducing a new stimulus in the days before a race. So if that means you're doing nothing different, fine. If that means during your peak week or for your long runs, you practice your kind of carb up, that's probably a good idea. Now, yeah, there's the talk or the sort of the official recommendations are 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate. Again, you're 80 kilogram athlete, that's almost a kilogram of carbohydrate. Very, very difficult. A few considerations. Number one, getting to that is a massive challenge. There was a meta-analysis, so a study of all the research ever done on carb loading that came out yesterday from Liverpool John Moores University, which is within sports science, one of arguably the most esteemed sports science university, full of unbelievable academics, most of them are out right now in America working with World Cup teams. These are very much creme de la creme sport nutrition researchers. And their conclusion was that there's actually not very good evidence that carbohydrate loading improves performance. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't improve performance. It just means we don't know. And when the answer is we don't know, I always come back to make sure you do something that sits well with you, that you've practiced, and give yourself the best chance of performing well. And so what that means is you probably do want to make sure you're consuming a decent amount of carbohydrates in the days before your race, but it doesn't need to consume your life. And you can make sure you do it conveniently. What you don't want is to get to the start line of your marathon and feel terrible. You want to feel like you're ready to race. And so number one, and there's a sort of the thing that I think people forget about carb loading is make sure it's carbohydrates that sit well in your stomach. Because if you're about to consume loads of pasta and you know that pasta really bloats you and makes you want to go to sleep, probably not the best thing to do. The recommendations are 8 to 12 grams per kilogram. I tend to push people on the lower end of that simply because just like the 90 grams an hour recommendation, we've got that difference between what works for an elite athlete, what works for everyone else, and also that weighing in for the fact that you want to get to race day and feel energetic and feel good and not feel like you can't possibly have any kind of carb gel because you're going to need to go to the toilet. 6 to 8 grams per kilogram, which is, again, for an 80 kilogram person, 320, 360 grams plus, you're kind of doing okay. And that's what people are consuming most of the time anyway. And so the low risk strategy here is consume more carbohydrate than you would normally, but you're probably okay not weighing it out. That can also be as simple as saying, right, I'm going to have a pack of sweets during the day, right? And, it's not a long-term health strategy, but you're getting in more carbohydrate than you normally would. and it doesn't tend to sit in your stomach too much. It's a simple sugar. It's quite easy to tolerate. People talk a lot about getting enough carbohydrate and don't talk about all the other things. And suddenly it becomes a little bit, you're just eating loads of food. And particularly, you go and have a nice pasta carbonara for dinner, you think, oh, I'm carb loading, but actually you're getting loads of fat in there as well, which isn't going to help your pre-race performance. And that's one of the reasons you might feel quite sluggish. And so it's as much about, if you're going to sort of strategize something for the days before, you kind of almost want to drop fat, drop protein slightly, and up carbohydrate. And so your actual calorie intake doesn't really change. You're sort of just strategizing, increasing carbohydrate. And you can do that through meals and a couple of snacks. And it doesn't have to be a day of just throwing food down your throat. There is research looking at dropping fiber in the days before. And that's quite a convenient way of reducing GI distress, so reducing the chance you're stopping at a Portaloo during your marathon. I tend to recommend don't eat more, just eat smarter. And what that means is drop your fiber intake, drop your fat intake, slightly drop your protein intake, but don't do anything crazy there. And then just replace it with extra carbohydrate. And so if you usually eat brown rice, move it to white rice, you got less fiber, same amount of carbohydrate. Same with your pastas, same with your breads. But make sure you're doing something you do in training. Don't suddenly say, right, I'm going to eat loads of bread now, when you barely ever eat bread, but you think, oh, this would be a great way of carb loading, because it's not going to end well. And so I think my one sentence sort of answer is keep it simple. What did you do for your longest training run? How did it go? It went fine. Okay. Maybe that's what you can do again. That's something new. People are always tempted to introduce new things for race day because this is the big day. Actually, it's the worst thing you can do. That's when things go wrong. And so the most important thing, and even if that means that someone's going to count out every gram of carbohydrate and consume 10 grams per kilogram, even if that's what you're going to do, just make sure you've done it before. And I'd much rather someone do that than try something completely new. And so we don't actually know if carbohydrate loading works, is the sort of the research-based takeaway there. And so from that, make of it what you will. I would always recommend starting with the base of what does the research say, then build in your own practice, your own training, your own experiences, and that's where you have your marathon race plan.
Yeah, I always suggest that the long run, say you're doing 7 or 8 long runs, each of those is a mini event, isn't it? And
absolutely, yeah.
You practice all this stuff. So you go to bed at the time you'll be going to bed before race day. You'll get up at roughly, if you can do the run in the morning, great. But if you can't, you just do as much as you possibly can to replicate what it'll be like on race day. And this is when you test all this stuff out, isn't it? Like you said, nothing
absolutely
on race day at all.
And even things like the kit you're going to wear, just the same applies completely.
Yeah.
Wear it during your long run. Don't wear anything that, it applies to nutrition. It applies to everything else. It applies to your shoes. It applies to the clothes you wear. All these sorts of things. And I think because especially when you're doing a big event, your London marathons, and it's so big and you're seeing everyone doing all these different things, and you might go to the expo and you've got all these funky looking foods and all this stuff. There's a nice pair of socks there. Maybe I'll wear those tomorrow. All these things, it makes it so hard to actually just keep it simple. I think, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I did it 4 weeks ago, my last long run. I'd practiced it before, and that was the strategy that worked. I had a great run, and I've done it 3 or 4 times. I know what I'm doing. Here's the plan. I just need to execute. And it's not very fashionable because it's not, I've got to have my 2 beetroot shots, and then I've got to wait, and I've got to have my sodium bicarbonate, and then I've got to, all these kind of things. And again, it's not even to say don't do that, because, if you want to try something like that, and beetroot, like I said, has good evidence, it works, but it's not special. If you've used it in training and you can tolerate it, great, go for it. You can run a marathon with no supplements. You can run a marathon with no gels. Like I said, guy I interviewed who had run 100 miles, wouldn't recommend it, with no exogenous carbohydrate at all. I think he had been having, he was using real foods, quote unquote, but not even carbohydrate-based foods. I think it was crisps and sort of mad things. Ultra marathon running is
different world, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's full of mad, amazing people.
It is.
But I think the big takeaway is don't overcomplicate it. Carbohydrate important. You can keep an eye on on how much you're having as a bit of a ballpark, and even I would say during your training runs the day before when you're practicing your sort of carb feed. I don't even really like using the word carb load because it kind of makes the assumption you're just sort of, having carbohydrate all day, which a lot of people are. But you could just out of interest weigh out or track your food to see, how much carbohydrate actually was that. Most people will find if they're consciously eating more carbohydrate, they're getting 6 up to maybe even 8 grams per kilogram without actually thinking, I've got to get a big carb load in. And so you're kind of getting to where the recommendations lie without even having to sort of worry about it too much. And
I think the problem is, Matt, that carb, the very name almost implies that you are sitting down to a huge plate of pasta or masses of jacket potatoes or whatever, just because the use of the word load, I mean, it just implies massive volume, and that just needn't be the case at all. But that's been absolutely fascinating. I'd very much like to go into some of these areas in a bit more detail another time. But that's a great summary for anyone looking to do a distance event. Fantastic tips in there. So thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks a lot. I think you probably noticed I could talk about these things forever. So yeah, no, I really enjoyed that.
Thanks for listening to this Sapphire Running Zone podcast. Keep checking back as we have lots more podcasts coming soon.